I am W.I. Black, otherwise known as the Writer in Black, and this is my channel dedicated to my short prose, poetry, musings, music, and any other thing that I feel like posting, but the focus will be primarily on my writings. Today I will be starting with a poem and then moving into one of my short stories. I hope you enjoy. Star Shell. Stars shall illuminate the pocked path of the angels, so far removed from their celestial abode. Wings of light which carry their message to the fallen creature in their sunken holes. Consumed by the grief of creation, they tread amongst the crimson lilies. Braided wire mimics the thorned rose. But gone is salvation from this land. A caress to the wounded brings only tears. As memories of a love lost are left unanswered, a spoiled innocence consumes the soured milk. But what beverage could propitiate their eternal thirst? The lowly lay in the dross's cradle, as if it were the hope of day that would bring them home. A Portentous Gathering, Part 1. In the northern lands of Arsena, nestled between the great twin mountains Craw and Dorad, was the valley of Old Oak, replete with the lazy stream of the Viridian. With its lush greenery and the high snow caps, the scene was quite picturesque. Within the valley resided the titular city of Old Oak, and within it its simple people. It was in this village that the tales of the Portentous Gathering first began to circulate. Addox was just a child when he heard the occult tales of the Glen Witches, the old maidens of yore. When the moon would hang low, ominous and shaded in sanguinary hues, the older witches, those shunned children of the ancient ways, would gather to pray to the Dark Master. Addox had heard the stories many times from the adults in the village. Each time he heard it, a hyperbolic addendum was added, some horrific tidbit which was left out previously until it was inconceivable that it could get any worse, but it always did. What had begun as a story of a group of old women worshipping the forest in accordance to the ancient native practices turned into ghastly rituals where the women were beckoning demons to ravish them. One particular evening, as he was delivering firewood to the tavern, he saw a man who had imbibed too many spirits. With slurred speech, he recounted another facet of the Glen which is not yet revealed. The drunk spoke of a child that would eventually be born from these dark gatherings to bring destruction on all of those who had forsaken the elder ways. The child would wield the powers of darkness in the forest, forged into a might that would cause their world to descend into utter chaos. That he would come in swift vengeance and stain the world in the blood of the infidels for sins committed against the innocent witches. Those who were in earshot of the inebriated harbinger began to point and laugh. It was one thing for the villagers to speak of witches casting hexes and curses while dancing around a fire bare to the skin, but another thing to speak of some druidic hellspawn which would bring ruin to their town. Some people began pelting the drunk. Finally, the tavern master stepped in to put an end to the debacle. Picking the man up by the shoulders, he shoved him out into the street. "Begone, you filthy lecher, and don't come back spouting your superstition," the tavern master barked. Tripping over the threshold, the drunk fell into a puddle with a loud splash. Once again, the patrons began laughing, and then after a while went back to their beverages. Seeing Addox, the tavern master told him to put the wood in the usual place and come back for payment. As Addox began unloading his cart, he spied the drunk lying in the puddle. The man had his eyes steadily on the boy. Slowly he got up and approached Addox. His skin was swarthy from dirt and grime, with a stench that was almost unbearable. Alcohol and body odor pervaded Addox's nostrils the moment he arrived before him. As he stood silent, his eyes began to roll into the back of his head. He then began addressing Addox with a grave tone that was the least bit slurred. "Mark my words well, boy. In a year not yet known, and with an absolute darkness never before envisioned, those witches will consummate their marriage to the Dark Lord and bear his twisted progeny. The people of this town have ridiculed and lashed out at those ancient children for far too long unabated. Fate swings heavy against the aggressor. Leave this place and never look back, or your soul too will face the infernal dregs of Tartarus." After finishing his portentous declaration, his eyes rolled back down, and he began again in his drunkenly state, singing old songs and dancing with abandon. Addox was unsure of what to make of the scenario. Finishing his task, he rushed back home to speak to his father about what had transpired. As Addox recalled the events, his father sat down wearing an expression of concentration. Upon finishing, his father took a deep breath and exhaled. "Son, these fables consume the life of many people here in this town. It was a way for them to pass the time by. Gossipers, a lot of them. When I was your age, we had the same stories, only with less embellishment. When I'd gotten a bit older, I decided to take a trip to the glen where the witches were purported to gather to perchance catch one of their nude gatherings. Upon my arrival to their sanctuary, I was stunned. All the stories were false. These women were not horrific beings that sacrificed children to appease some high evil, nor were they nubile beauties. They were merely elderly druids wise in the ways of the old ways. and the earth was home to many gods. In another time period, they would have been considered royalty, but what I saw was pitiful. They were feeble, destitute, and without hope. They languished in the arcane erudition with their esoteric texts guiding them towards a light which had burned out ages before. I pitied them so much that I went back to the village and brought them food for the table. When I approached, they recoiled, but soon submitted to my gift. They did not speak nor make motions with their hands, but merely bowed and turned back to their altar. They had some sort of icon, no doubt, a symbol of one of the old gods suspended above the altar that they had been praying to. I eyed it briefly and then left. I've never told anyone what I saw, nor what I did. I knew they would accuse me of being an accursed acolyte of the forest if I had. Told you these things because I don't want you to be caught up in the stories the townfolk like to tell. That drunk was nothing more than that. Pay no heed to his fantastical talk, nor theirs. After his fathers finished the account, he said it was time for bed. Putting out all the candles, Alex crawled into the bed and began thinking about the stories of the witches, the drunk harbinger, and what his father had said. What his father said put his mind at ease, but the drunk was so sincere and impassioned with his declaration. Was it possible he could be correct? As he drifted off into dreamland, he was assaulted by a phantasmagoria. He saw the cosmos at its conception, the elder gods who ruled the world in bygone times, the Glen witches in their wooded church, the townspeople, his father, the drunk, and then a formless shadow that seemed to speak with an insidious voice. He was unsure what it had admitted, but it sounded like mythog. All of a sudden, he was brought again before the witches, but they were not as his father had described them. These were not feeble crones or hapless elders, but strong, unholy women. The dark maidens howled and shrieked as they supplicated their dark lord. They were foul utterances and odious chanting. Blood was spilt and bones scattered. As they read the fates, they moaned in ecstasy and torment. They beseeched the darkness to bring forth the one who would bathe them in vengeance's glory. How they have suffered at the hands of the unbelievers, pariahs of the forest, forgotten ones. On that night, the juice from the vine of the wicked had been tasted, and they swooned in rhapsodic abandon. The ceremony was beginning to take a different turn. One by one, they began silently to form a circle until each one locked hands with those adjacent. With heads bowed, their leader, a wizened old grandmother of the forest, appeared, covered in the blood of a number of woodland creatures, and began an incantation in a deep and gruff voice that a spectator would have been bewildered to know that it was from this meek one. The words were arcane and malignant, calling forth of nefarious powers to grant them an audience with unspeakable evils. Again, that whisper, mythog, ran in his ears. Suddenly Addox awoke, drenched in sweat, tears pouring down his face and chest heaving as he gasped for air. The nightmare had finished and left its mark. Slowly he calmed down and then drifted back into sleep, never awaking until morning. Part 2. It had been 30 years since Addox had had the nightmare. While his father and mother had perished to the fragility of old age, he had now had his own family and had established a residence outside of Old Oak Village. The stories of the Glen witches still pervaded the townfolk unabated. He had grown so weary of hearing them over the years as he made his weekly trip into town that he began to tune them out. Just like his father told him, the stories grew more abstruse. The witches became demons, their prayers became sacrifices, and the rain became blood. It was all too much at times. He yearned to correct them and be done with these tales, but he could never risk retaliation from the villagers, not with a family to tend for. As his son came of age to wander into the forest with his friends, Edix grew fearful. He did not yet understand why, since he himself had been in the forest many times unharmed as a child. The predators that had once roamed there were hunted to extinction nearly 100 years earlier to allow the flourishing of animals to provide an ample food supply, but he still couldn't figure it out. He told himself it wasn't the Glen witches. His father had dispelled that myth, yet there was always a place in his mind that festered with the possibility of the dream he had had so long ago. Despite his best judgment, he did not forbid his son to enter the forest. On a day like many others, Addox found himself in the forest collecting firewood for the upcoming week. It was a cold day when the clouds obscuring the light from the sun, creating a dreary ambience. In the shallow breeze, the only sounds to be heard in the air were the swing and catch of Addox's axe. In between strikes, Addox thought he heard an odd sound. Was it a whisper? It had begun faint, but soon intensified. It sounded more like chanting now. Feeling drawn, he began in the direction of the voices. His heart grew faint. He did not know the meaning, but the sound was recognizable. He had heard it when he was a child in that ill-fated dream. The closer he got, the chanting getting louder still, the slower his stride became, until it was an imperceptible shuffle. The scenery had shifted too. Where has been a landscape of glorious oak that was strong and proud, now stood a forest of spindly and bare birch, bone-like in its presentation. As he finally came upon the hill his father had once stood, he could see down below the baneful procession he had heard about so many times before. The witches, with hands linked around an altar constructed of wood and bone, chanting the primordial tongue. Blood saturated their hands and the earth around them as the carcasses of animals lay strewn in piles upon the sanctuary, their small and contorted features a testament of the evil unfolding. He was so struck by the sight of the witches that he did not notice another witch ushering in a small boy into the circle. His heart stopped as the boy was his son. He was frozen in abject terror, unable to speak or move despite his best efforts. The one who ushered the boy in, who could only be the matriarch, turned towards Addox and, as though speaking to him, began the incantation. He did not understand, nor did he care. He only prayed that she would cease, as the words caused his head to pound and stomach to twist. When the tension seemed enough to cause his very being to explode, she stopped. He fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The other coven members recited their parts, and then it began. The matriarch addressed him. Addox, she croaked with a voice almost inhuman, upon this eve you shall bring a seed to wet the ground that feed the roots of the undervale. You are chosen for an honorable purpose, to share in the supplication to the one of perdition. Fulfill your purpose. Grant us the son of the forest, that he may bear our vengeance. She stopped, retrieving a large dagger from a scabbard on the altar. Turning her gaze to the child, she began again in that mystical tongue. It was the last word that Artax knew that made his blood chill. Mythog. Let my son go, screamed Artax. He is but a boy. I will fulfill your desire, but let him go. His innocence need not be spilt. The matriarch showed her yellow crooked teeth in a pernicious grin. It is his innocence that shall benefit us, and damn you. Suddenly she sunk the dagger into the boy's neck, blood spraying her in crimson currents. The gurgling sound of his choking was sickening. Artax moaned in pain, shrieking into the night. It was then that he noticed his axe upon the ground and became enraged. He felt boistered in such a sudden manner that he didn't realize he was rushing down the hill towards the coven with an axe raised above his head. His malice for them could never have been more apparent as he hacked and slashed at the witches, blood spewing forth in copious amounts. It happened in such a blur. They did not offer opposition, but merely wept in turn as the axe was focused on them. Finally, Attucks faced the matriarch. As the others, she did not offer resistance, but simply bowed her head. Completing his revenge, he buried the axe deep into the skull of the matriarch. The crunch of split bones satisfied him as he was splayed with her blood. Feeling the lust wane, he turned towards the destruction, and his fallen son slumping to the ground. Crying bitter tears, he crawled to his son's side and began to cradle his lifeless body. After what could have been an eon, he rose off the ground with his son in his arms and placed him on the hill. Looking down once more at the hideous sight, he resolved to destroy this demonic sanctuary, setting the wooded altar and the area around it ablaze. As he began his journey back to town with his son on his shoulders, he mused on what lay before him. He would have to explain his son's death, the actuality of the Glen witches and their atrocities, and then his own hand in their death. The funeral for his son was small and quiet. The town could not believe what had transpired. They found it difficult that the witches had been able to continue on for so long before they were finally slain. Addox told his wife what his father had told him when he was a boy, and despite her being stricken with grief from the loss of her son, tried to comfort Addox that there was no way he could have known. He did not tell her about his dream. He would never recount that night to anyone as long as he lived. Lying in bed, he was pricked with a sense of unease as he replayed what the matriarchs had told him about his purpose. Rest did not come for a long time, but eventually it did, and with it another strange dream. Addox stood in a grove filled with a number of graves. There was a child standing before him in a black robe and hood, face obscured in darkness. The child emanated familiarity, but he wasn't sure. He believed it was his son, yet he was different. Then it spoke. You did well, father. They knew you would succeed if they chose you, and you did. You are fearful, but you shouldn't be. The harvest will yield what was sown, and all shall reap of its fruit. He was unsure if it emanated from the boy or some disembodied spirit he could not see, but as it finished, the boy disappeared. He never dreamt again. Part 3. It had been 60 years since the first dream, and 30 since the last. It was also 30 years since his son was murdered from the ritual of the Glen Witches. Addox was an old man now. The town recalled his honorable deeds annually with a festival, deeming him the Glen Witch Slayer. The 30th festival was nearing its end when Addox stole away unseen into the forest. The path was familiar to him. He had taken it every year since that day. He began ruminating on the years that had passed and the son he had never got to see grow up. He wondered how many people had been slain by the witches over the countless years they existed in the forest. Maybe they had cast a spell on his father not to see them as they truly were. He did not know and cared less than he did the year before. Finally, he arrived at the clearing. Nothing had ever grown back over the years, a black char hanging to the remnants of the land. Seeing the sight always brought back memories, and he could never understand why he brought himself here, but the thought of this purpose never eluded him. Having his fill, he turned to leave, but was caught by a sight he hadn't perceived before. The ground looked distorted, almost bubbled up. He didn't recognize it before, but somehow felt it was always like that. A dark feeling began to creep over Attucks. He started hearing a whisper in his head, or was it aloud? A slow, drawn-out speech that caused him to shiver. Mythog. He could never understand what it meant, and it tormented him all of his days. It was sudden when it happened, but realization stole over him, and he cried out into the night. The ground, swollen with an unholy burden, began to pulsate and constrict. The wind bellowed as if a horn of some unholy herald blew at the moment when emphasis was greatest. Attucks was thrown to the ground as the earth began to rend. A black ichor began to rise effervescently from the soil where roots were unhinged and came to life like the tentacles of some leviathan. The beast, for what else could it be, began to rise from the wound, or was it a grave? Afterbirth clinging to it, its stench shone holy and fierce. As the sun had already begun to set since he lingered too long, it was difficult for Attucks to make out what the creature looked like. It was enormous, like some giant oak. It was a head with a gaping hole for a face that resembled an endless void, many wings as wide as mountains, its arms and legs ending in clawed talons already dripping with the blood of the earth and God knew what else. Attucks felt his heart begin to seize. He clutched his chest in futile effort, any subsequent sounds being quelled from the horror and pain. The creature approached Attucks, peering down at him with its cavernous face. Attucks waited for the death blow, but it did not come. The thing spoke but one word to him in a voice he had not heard in 30 years. Mythog. Attucks died as it finished speaking. The creature looked into the direction of the village, issuing a demonic howl. The moon would once again be painted with sanguinary hues. For those of you who stayed until the end, thank you for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe. Also, if you liked the story, please tell me what you liked about it, and the same if you didn't like it. Introspection is a wonderful tool, but outside eyes reveal things that we can't see. I'd like to give a shout out to Crashhermit. For those of you who enjoy live stream study sessions, he is the man to go to. I'd also like to give a shout out to Commonosophy, a philosophical podcast that me and my friend DK Bird will be setting up soon, touching on existential questions and other issues of life. Thank you again. Until next time.